All right, this is part 6, the last part of a series of unfortunate events, The Reptile Room, Book 2, and it's chapters 12 and 13, the last 2 chapters. This is a picture for chapter 12. I promise you that this is the last time that I will use the phrase, meanwhile back at the ranch. Good. But I think of no other way to return to the moment when Claus has just explained to Mr. Poe that Sonny had meant what Sonny had meant by shouting aha, and now everyone in the reptile room was staring at Stefano. Sonny looked triumphant. Claus looked defiant. Mr. Poe looked furious. Dr. Lucafont looked worried. You couldn't tell how the incredibly deadly viper looked, but the facial expressions of snakes are difficult to read. Stefano looked back at all the people silently. His face fluttering as he tried to decide whether to come clean, a phrase which here means admit that he's really Count Olaf and up to no good, or perpetuate his deception, a phrase which here means lie, lie, lie. Stefano, Mr. Poe said, and coughed into his handkerchief. Claus and Sonny waited impatiently for him to continue. Stefano, explain yourself. You have just told us that you are an expert on snakes. Previously, however, you told us you knew nothing of snakes, and therefore couldn't have been involved in Dr. Montgomery's death. What is going on? When I told you I knew nothing of snakes, Stefano said, I was being modest. Now, if you will excuse me, I have to go outside for a moment, and... You weren't being modest, Claus cried. You were lying. And you are lying now. You are nothing but a liar and a murderer. Stefano's eyes grew wide and his face clouded in anger. You have no evidence of that, he said. Yes, we do, said a voice in the doorway, and everyone turned to find Violet standing there with a smile on her face and evidence in her arms. Triumphantly, she walked across the reptile room to the far end, where the books Claus had been reading about the Mamba du Mal were still stacked in a pile. The others followed her, walking down the aisles of reptiles. Silently, she arranged the objects in a line on top of the table. The glass vial with the sealed rubber cap, the syringe with a sharp needle, the small bunch of folded papers, a card laminated in plastic, the powder puff, and a small hand mirror. What is all of this? Mr. Poe said, gesturing to the arrangement. This, Violet said, is evidence which I found in Stefano's suitcase. My suitcase, Stefano said, is private property, which you are not allowed to touch. It's very rude of you, and besides, it's locked. It was an emergency, Violet said calmly, so I picked the lock. How did you do that? Mr. Poe asked. Nice girls shouldn't know how to do such things. My sister is a nice girl, Claus said, and she knows how to do all sorts of things. Perfect, Sonny agreed. Well, we'll discuss that later, Mr. Poe said. In the meantime, please continue. When Uncle Monty died, Violet began, my siblings and I were very sad, but we were also very suspicious. We weren't suspicious, Claus exclaimed. If someone is suspicious, it means they're not sure. We were positive that Stefano killed him. Nonsense, Dr. Lucafont said. As I explained to all of you, Montgomery's death was an accident. The Mamba du Mal escaped from its cage and bit him, and that's all there is to it. I beg your pardon, Violet said, but that is not all there is to it. Claus read up on the Mamba du Mal and found out how it killed its victims. Claus walked over to the stack of books, opened the one on top. He had marked his place with a small piece of paper, so he found what he was looking for right away. The Mamba du Mal, he read out loud, is one of the deadliest snakes in the hemisphere, noted for its strangulatory grip, used in conjunction with its deadly venom, giving all of its victims a tenebrous hue, which is ghastly to behold. He put the book down and turned to Mr. Poe. Strangulatory means... We know what the word means, Stefano shouted. Then you must know, Claus said, that the Mamba du Mal did not kill Uncle Monty. His body didn't have a tenebrous hue. It was pale as could be. That's true, Mr. Poe said, but it doesn't necessarily indicate that Dr. Montgomery was murdered. Yes, Dr. Lucafont said. Perhaps just this once the snake didn't feel like bruising its victims. It is more likely, Violet said, that Uncle Monty was killed with these items. She held up the glass vial with the sealed rubber cap, the vial labeled Venom du Mal, and it's obviously from Uncle Monty's cabinet of venom samples. Then she held up the syringe with a sharp needle. Stefano, Olaf, took the syringe and injected its venom into Uncle Monty. Then he poked an extra hole so it would look like the snake had bitten him. But I love Dr. Montgomery, Stefano said. I would have had nothing to gain from his death. Sometimes when someone tells a ridiculous lie, it is best to ignore it entirely. When I turn 18, as we all know, Violet continued, ignoring Stefano entirely, I inherit the Baudelaire fortune, and Stefano intended to get that fortune for himself. It would be easier to do so if I were in a location that was more difficult to trace, such as Peru. Violet held up the small bunch of folded papers. These are the tickets for the Prospero, leaving Hazy Harbor for Peru at 5 o'clock today. That's where Stefano is taking us when he happened to run into you, Mr. Poe. But Uncle Monty tore up Stefano's ticket to Peru, Claus said, looking confused. I saw him. That's true, Violet said. That's why he had to get Uncle Monty out of the way. He killed Uncle Monty. Violet stopped for a minute and shuddered. He killed Uncle Monty and then took this laminated card. It's Monty's membership for the Herpetological Society. Stefano planned to pose as Uncle Monty to get on board the Prospero and whisk us away to Peru. But I don't understand, Mr. Poe said. How does Stefano even know about your fortune? Because he's really Count Olaf, Violet said, exasperated that she had to explain what she and her siblings and you and I knew the moment Stefano arrived at the house. He may have shaved his head and trimmed off his eyebrows, but the only way he could get rid of that tattoo on his left ankle was with this powder puff and hand mirror. There's makeup all over his left ankle to hide the eye, and I'll bet if we rub it with a cloth, we can see the tattoo. That's absurd, Stefano cried. We'll see about that, Mr. Poe replied. Now who has a cloth? Not me, Claus said. Not me, Violet said. Sonny said. Well, if nobody has a cloth, we might as forget the whole thing, Dr. Lucafont said, but Mr. Poe held up a finger to tell him to wait. To the relief of the Baudelaire orphans, he reached into his pocket and withdrew his handkerchief. Your left ankle, please, he said sternly to Stefano. But you've been coughing into that all day, Stefano said. It has germs. If you are really who the children say you are, Mr. Poe said, then germs are the least of your problems. Your left ankle, please. Stefano, and this is the last time, thank goodness, we'll have to call him by his phony name, gave a little growl and put his left pants leg up to reveal his ankle. Mr. Poe knelt down and rubbed at it for a few minutes, but at first, nothing appeared to happen, but then, like a sun shining through the clouds at the end of a terrible rainstorm, the faint outline of an eye began to appear. Clearer and clearer it grew until it was dark as it had been when the orphans first saw it, back when they lived with Count Olaf. Violet and Claus and Sonny stared at the eye, and the eye stared back. For the first time in their lives, the orphans were happy to see it. Chapter 13, last chapter. There's the picture. If this were a book written to entertain small children, you would know what would happen next. With the villain's identity and evil plans exposed, the police would arrive on the scene and place him in jail for the rest of his life. And the plucky youngsters would go out for a pizza and live happily ever after. But this book about the Baudelaire orphans, and you and I know that these three unfortunate children living happily ever after is about as likely as Uncle Monty returning to life. Whew. But it seemed to the Baudelaire orphans, as the tattoo became evident, that at least a little bit of Uncle Monty had come back to them as they proved Count Olaf's treachery once and for all. That's the eye, all right, Mr. Poe said, and stopped rubbing Count Olaf's ankle. You are most definitely Count Olaf, and you are most definitely under arrest. And I am most definitely shocked, Dr. Lucafont said, clapping his oddly solid hands to his head. As am I, Mr. Poe agreed, grabbing Count Olaf's arm in case he tried to run anywhere. Violet, Claus, Sonny, please forgive me for not believing you earlier. It just seemed too far-fetched that he would have searched you out, disguised himself as a laboratory assistant, and concocted an elaborate plan to steal your fortune. I wonder what happened to Gustav, Uncle Monty's real lab assistant. Claus wondered out loud. If Gustav hadn't quit, then Uncle Monty would have never hired Count Olaf. Count Olaf had been quiet this whole time, ever since the tattoo appeared. His shiny eyes had darted this way and that, watching everyone carefully, the way a lion will watch a herd of antelope, looking for the one that would be best to kill and eat. But at the mention of Gustav's name, he spoke up. Gustave didn't quit, he said in a wheezy voice. Gustave is dead. One day, when he was out collecting wildflowers, I drowned him in the swarthy swamp. Then I forged a note saying he quit. Count Olaf looked at the 3 children, as if he were going to run over and strangle them, but instead, he stood absolutely still, which somehow was even scarier. But that's nothing compared to what I will do to you, orphans. You have won this round of the game, but I will return for your fortune and for your precious skin. This is not a game, you horrible man, Mr. Poe said. Dominoes is a game. Water polo is a game. Murder is a crime, and you will go to jail for it. I will drive you to the police station in town right this very minute. Oh, drat, I can't. My car is wrecked. Well, I'll take you down in Dr. Montgomery's Jeep, and you children can follow along in Dr. Gaffant's car. I guess you'll be able to see inside of a doctor's automobile after all. It might be easier, Dr. Lucafont said, to put Stefano in my car and have the children follow behind. After all, Dr. Montgomery's body is in my car, so there's no room for all 3 children anyway. Well, Mr. Poe said, I'd hate to disappoint the children if they've had such a trying time. We can move Dr. Montgomery's body to the Jeep, and we couldn't care less about the inside of a doctor's automobile, Violet said impatiently. We only made that up so we wouldn't be trapped alone with Count Olaf. You shouldn't tell lies, orphans, Count Olaf said. I don't think you are in a position to give moral lectures to children, Olaf, Mr. Poe said sternly. All right, Dr. Lucafont, you take him. Dr. Lucafont grabbed Count Olaf's shoulder with one of his oddly stiff hands and led the way out of the reptile room and to the front door, stopping at the doorway to give Mr. Poe and the 3 children a thin smile. Say goodbye to the orphans, Count Olaf, Dr. Lucafont said. Goodbye, Count Olaf said. Goodbye, Violet said. Goodbye, Claus said. Mr. Poe coughed into his handkerchief and gave a sort of disgusted half-wave at Count Olaf, indicating goodbye. But Sunny didn't say anything. Violet and Claus looked down at her, surprised that she hadn't said yeet or lebo or any of her various terms for goodbye. But Sunny was staring at Dr. Lucafont with a determined look in her eye, and in a moment she leaped in the air and bit him on the hand. Sunny, Violet said, and was about to apologize for her behavior when she saw Dr. Lucafont's whole hand come loose from his arm and fall to the floor. As Sunny clamped down on it with her 4 sharp teeth, the hand made a cracking sound, like breaking wood or plastic rather than skin or bone. And when Violet looked at the place where Dr. Lucafont's hand had been, she saw no blood or indication of a wound, but a shiny metal hook. Dr. Lucafont looked at the hook too, and then at Violet, and grinned horribly. Count Olaf grinned too, and in a second the 2 of them darted out the door. The hook-handed man, Violet shouted. He's not a doctor. He's one of Count Olaf's henchmen. Instinctively, Violet grabbed the air where the 2 men had been standing, but of course they weren't there. She opened the front door wide and saw the 2 of them sprinting through the snake-shaped hedges. After them, Claus shouted, and the 3 Baudelaires started to run through the door. But Mr. Poe stopped in front of them and blocked their way. No, he cried. But it's the hook-handed man, Violet shouted, and he and Olaf will get away. I can't let you run out after 2 dangerous criminals, Mr. Poe replied. I am responsible for the safety of you children, and I will not have any harm come to you. Then you go after them, Claus cried. But hurry. Mr. Poe began to step out the door, but he stopped when he heard the roar of a car engine starting up. The 2 ruffians, a word which here means horrible people, had reached Dr. Lucafont's car and were already driving away. Get in the Jeep, Violet exclaimed. Follow them. A grown man, Mr. Poe said sternly, does not get involved in a car chase. This is a job for the police. I'll go call them now, and maybe they can set up roadblocks. The Baudelaire youngsters watched Mr. Poe shut the door and race to the telephone, and their hearts sank. They knew it was no use. By the time Mr. Poe was through explaining the situation to the police, Count Olaf and the hook-handed man were sure to be long gone. Suddenly exhausted, Violet, Claus, and Sunny walked to Uncle Monty's enormous suitcase and sat down at the bottom of the step, listening to the faint sound of Mr. Poe talking on the phone. They knew that trying to find Count Olaf and the hook-handed man, particularly when it grew dark, would be like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Despite their anxiety over Count Olaf's escape, the 3 orphans must have fallen asleep for a few hours, for the next thing they knew, it was nighttime and they were on the bottom step. Somebody had placed a blanket over them, and they had stretched themselves. And as they had stretched themselves, they saw 3 men in overalls walking out of the reptile room, carrying some reptiles in their cages. Behind them walked a chubby man in brightly colored plaid suit, who stopped when they were awake. "Hey, kids," the chubby man said in a loud, booming voice. "I'm sorry if I woke you, but my team has to move quickly." "Who are you?" Violet asked. "It is confusing to fall asleep in the daytime and wake up at night." "What are you doing with Uncle Monty's reptiles?" Claus asked. "It is also confusing to realize that you have been sleeping on stairs rather than bed or sleeping bag." "Dick Sneak?" Sunny asked. "It is always confusing why anyone would choose to wear a plaid suit." "The name's Bruce," Bruce said. "I am the director of marketing for the Herpetological Society. Your friend Mr. Poe called me to come and retrieve the snakes now that Dr. Montgomery has passed on." "Retrieve" means take away. "We know what the word retrieve means," Claus said, "but why are you taking them? Where are they going?" "Well, you three are orphans, right? You'll be moving on to some other relative who won't die on you like Montgomery did. And these snakes need to be taken care of, so we're giving them away to other scientists, zoos, and retirement homes. Those who can't find homes for will have to put to sleep." "But they're Uncle Monty's collection," Claus cries. "It took him years to find all these reptiles. You can't just scatter them to the winds." "It's the way it has to be," Bruce said smoothly. He was still talking in a very loud voice for no apparent reason. "Viper!" Sunny shouted, and began to crawl toward the reptile room. "What my sister means," Violet explained, "is that she's very close friends with one of the snakes. Could we just take one with us, the incredibly deadly Viper?" "First off, no," Bruce said. "That guy Poe said all the snakes now belong to us. And second off, if you think I'm going to let small children near the incredibly deadly Viper, think again." "But the incredibly deadly Viper is harmless," Violet said. "Its name is a misnomer." Bruce scratched his head. "A what?" "That means a wrong name," Claus explained. "Uncle Monty discovered it, so he got to name it." "But the guy was supposed to be brilliant," Bruce said. He reached into a pocket in his plaid jacket and pulled out a cigar. "Giving a snake a wrong name doesn't sound brilliant to me. It sounds idiotic. But then, what can you expect from a man whose own name is Montgomery? "It is not nice," Claus says, "to lampoon someone's name like that." "I don't have time to ask you what lampoon means," Bruce said, "but if the baby here wants to wave bye-bye to the incredibly deadly Viper, she'd better do it soon. It's already outside." Sunny began to crawl toward the front door, but Claus was not through talking to Bruce. "Our Uncle Monty was brilliant," he said firmly. "He was a brilliant man," Violet agreed, "and we will always remember him as such." "Brilliant," Sunny shrieked in mid-crawl, and her sibling smiled down at her, surprised she had uttered a word that everyone could understand. Bruce lit up his cigar and blew smoke into the air, and then shrugged. "It's nice you feel that way, kid," he said. "Good luck wherever they put you." He looked at a shiny diamond watch on his wrist and turned to walk to the men in overalls. "Let's get a move on. In 5 minutes we have to be back on that road that smells like ginger." "It's horseradish," Violet corrected, but Bruce had already walked away. She and Claus looked at each other and began to follow Sunny outside, to wave goodbye to their reptile friends. But as they reached the door, Mr. Poe walked in the room and blocked them again. "I see you're awake, he said. "Please go upstairs and go to sleep then. We have to get up very early in the morning." "We just want to say goodbye to the snakes," Claus said, but Mr. Poe shook his head. "You'll get in Bruce's way," he replied. "Plus, I would think you three would never want to see snakes again." The Bottle Air orphans looked at one another and sighed. Everything in the world seemed wrong. It was wrong that Uncle Monty was dead. It was wrong that Count Olaf and the hook-handed man had escaped. It was wrong for Bruce to think of Monty as a person with a silly name instead of a brilliant scientist. And it was wrong to assume that the children never wanted to see a snake again. The snakes, and indeed everything in the reptile room, were the last reminders the Baudelaires had of the few happy days they'd spent there at the house. The few happy days they had since their parents had perished. Even though they understood that Mr. Poe wouldn't let them live alone with the reptiles, it was all wrong never to see them again, without even saying goodbye. Ignoring Mr. Poe's instructions, Violet, Claus, and Sunny rushed out the door where the men in overalls were loading the cages into a van with Herpetological Society written on the back. It was a full moon, and the moonlight reflected off the glass walls of the reptile room, as though it were a large jewel with a bright, bright shine. Brilliant, one might say. When Bruce had used the word brilliant about Uncle Monty, he meant having a reputation for cleverness or intelligence. But when the children used the word, and when they thought of it now, staring at the reptile room glowing in the moonlight, it meant more than that. It meant that even in the bleak circumstance of their current situation, even throughout the series of unfortunate events that would happen to them for the rest of their lives, Uncle Monty and his kindness would shine in their memories Uncle Monty was brilliant, and their time with him was brilliant. Bruce and his men from the Herpetological Society could dismantle Uncle Monty's collection, but nobody could ever dismantle the way the Baudelaires would think of him. Goodbye, goodbye, the Baudelaire orphans called as the incredibly deadly Viper was loaded onto the truck. Goodbye, goodbye, they called, and even though the Viper was Sonny's special friend, Violet and Claus found themselves crying along with their sister, and when the incredibly deadly Viper looked up to see them, they saw it was crying too, tiny, shiny tears falling from its green eyes. The Viper was brilliant too, and as the children looked at one another, they saw their own tears and the way they had shone. You're brilliant, Violet murmured to Claus, reading up the Mamadou Mall. You're brilliant, Claus murmured back, getting the evidence out of Stefano's suitcase. Brilliant, Sonny said again, and Violet and Claus gave their baby sister a hug. Even the youngest Baudelaire was brilliant for distracting the adult with the incredibly deadly Viper. Goodbye, goodbye, the brilliant Baudelaires called, and waved to Uncle Monty's reptiles. They stood together in the moonlight and kept waving, even when Bruce shut the doors of the van, even as the van drove past the snake-shaped hedges and down the driveway to Lousy Lane, and even when it turned the corner and disappeared into the dark. Here's a picture. And that's the end.